Hello, everyone. Mike Lagerquist here from Vine Faith in Action. Today, we're very lucky. We've got a regular presenter with us today, Scott Kudelka from the DNR, the Naturalist at Minneopa State Park, Flandrau State Park. Which other one, Scott?
Fort Ridgely.
Fort Ridgely, that's right, is here. And today he's going to talk about the Minnesota River, the story behind that. But I think I would be amiss in my duties if I didn't ask first if Scott could give us a quick update on what's happening with the bison out at Minneopa State Park. So Scott, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Well, good afternoon, everybody. The bison are doing well. We now actually have 46. And
Wow.
you might wonder, how did we gain 3? We actually gained 3 because 3 were moved, 3 young cows were moved here from Blue Mountain State Park. And then we're expecting actually another cow from the Minnesota Zoo sometime in November. So the calves look like everybody else. They've long lost that reddish orange coat. And they have gained a lot of weight from that original about 45 pounds when they're born to around anywhere from 300 to 400 pounds. We've gone through our breeding season, and we'll see how things line up for next year. No other questions about the bison herd. I'm just going to start.
I would just ask, because Scott presented about bison at Kiwanis earlier this week, you want to tell people how many folks have been coming through the park and where that place is, Minneopa?
Yeah, that's great. In fact, I just talked to our park manager Tuesday, and he was telling me on Saturday we had over 1,000 vehicles at the Waterfalls, and that is the most vehicles we've ever had at Minneopa at one time. And I imagine a lot of that had to do with just really the perfect day and the fact that we are at peak, now probably a little past peak with fall colors. And Tim Pulis, who is one of our bison ambassadors, said he talked to over 350 people on Saturday up at Setman Mill. And that doesn't include everybody, that would walk past him. That's just people that he actually directly talked to. So we are continually being busy, and I would expect, even with these cooler temperatures, people will still come on out, and especially see the waterfalls and the bison herd. All right, well, let's go into our story today, which is about the Minnesota River. And this one, I've actually been talking about the Minnesota River for even beyond before I became the Minneopa area naturalist, when I worked for the Water Resources Center at Minnesota State University in Mankato here. And really, the Minnesota River hasn't had the greatest conversation around it more recently because of water quality issues. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you back to how it was formed, some of the early observations by some of these Euro-American explorers, talking about some of the landscape, what it looked like really prior to pre-settlement. And then also talk about some of the things that have happened, people paddling the river here more in modern times. The photo that you see here is actually at Fort Snelling State Park up in St. Paul. The Minnesota River is flowing in on the left side into the Mississippi River. So this would be the confluence. This is where the Minnesota River ends, and Minnesota is a Dakota word. It's been spelled differently in the past. Min, M-I-N-N, actually means water. So if you think about Minneopa, same thing. And then when you're talking about the other letters, T-O or T-A actually means blue. And this has been translated, depending on where you see it, either as clear blue water or cloudy blue water. water, again, depending on the pronunciation. And I'm going to just talk about what that actually means as we go along here. So this is really a large watershed, as you can see off on the left there. It actually encompasses almost 20% of Minnesota. Then there is a small portion on the Blue Earth River watershed in Iowa, and then a little portion of South Dakota and North Dakota. Encompasses 37 counties, either fully in the watershed or just partially in the watershed. It's roughly about 16,700 square miles or 10.7 million acres. And when the Minnesota actually flows into the Mississippi, it actually doubles the Mississippi. So we are the largest tributary in Minnesota flowing into the Mississippi. Some people say the Minnesota starts up at Big Stone Lake. Others, and I do prefer this version, is that it actually starts in South Dakota at a place called Seachy Hollow State Park. And that is the Little Minnesota River, which then flows into the far end of Big Stone Lake. And then the photo I have here, this is actually up Upper Sioux State Park as the Minnesota River flows by there. So when we talk about the term Minnesota, before that term came, and that's really, if you think about it, unusual in some cases that you would take a native language or native word and use to describe a place. Many times Euro-Americans or Europeans used words from their own past or their own history. And that was the case originally for the river. They actually called it St. Peter's River. So you can think about the city of St. Peter and how the Dakota described it to these Europeans or Euro-Americans, these early settlers, is they would drop milk into water. And so when we think about water quality and the amount of sediment in there, there would have been sediment in the water. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go along. But as much sediment as we see today, no. We wouldn't have seen that amount of sediment where you could not see the bottom of the river. Really, the story starts with the glaciers. When you think about how glaciers covered this landscape, not the entire landscape, but parts of the landscape starting 2 million years ago, all the way up to 10,000 years ago. That seems like a long time ago, but in geology terms, that's relatively short. Our last glacier started coming north about 14,000 years ago, and it would have covered everything from the North Pole to the northern United States. And you can actually see where the glaciers carved that last time, and so that is the more greenish area. And you can see down near that right-hand corner, that's the Minnesota River Valley as it flows from Big Stone down to what today is Mankato, and then it makes that bounce. So it gives you a really good idea of how that sticks out on the landscape. And really, the story of the Minnesota River Valley starts somewhere else. And where it starts is actually up in North Dakota, northern Minnesota, and then of course into Canada. So what happens with glaciers is they move southward, is they're pushing dirt, rocks, and other debris in front of them. Think about it kind of as a big bulldozer. And so they're carving, that's how that landscape becomes flattened. They're carving as they go along, and then once those cooler temperatures begin to warm up, of course the glacier will stop and then what we call it is retreating, and it's retreating back northward. But you have to remember is, as it retreats, the ice is melting, and the water that's forming behind the glacier can't move, of course, to the north because of ice still there. And then it also can't move south because it had created what in effect is a dam down in a place called Browns Valley. And that is at the far end of our watershed. And then, of course, the Red River is on the other side of that. And so, in essence, as that glacier continued to retreat back northward and melting, this huge lake formed, what we call Glacial Lake Agassiz. And if you've ever been to places like Fargo Moorhead, you can see how it was a glacial lake. It's flat as anywhere on the face of the earth. And on that western edge, as you're traveling across North Dakota, I-94, you hit this ridge as you climb out of what we would call a beach ridge. And that's where the water would lap up against, and it created this basically ridge that follows the western edge of the Red River Valley. So you have this huge body of water, and at the tail end there by what's now Browns Valley, there would have been a dam full of rocks and mud, and also probably ice in there. And then once that ice started melting, and the rocks started giving away, this wall of water started flowing down, and it was probably following what was a smaller stream that was formed from some of this glacial ice that had been melting. It wouldn't have been too much of a stream, but enough for this wall of water to follow it. And when I'm talking about a wall water, when you look at the Minnesota River Valley, in places it can be up to 5 miles wide and 200 feet deep. So that's a huge area. And you can see in this photo of how it created the valley, and then you can see in that photo on the right-hand side what is now the current Minnesota River. And so really it followed a south east path, and then it hit this area Mankato, and it basically bounced, almost like a check mark, and it bounced to the northeast. And originally geologists thought that maybe it hit harder rock, and that's why it bounced. But we know today that down here we don't have the quartzite and the harder rock that we see farther to the west in the Minnesota River Valley. What we have is in essence sandstone. And so that wall of water would have been easily enough to carve through it. But what we think happened is there was another glacial lake called much smaller one called Minnesota Glacial Lake. And that had started a channel forming to the northeast. And so we think Glacial River Warren hit that channel, and then it was an easier path, and it just followed its way through. What's interesting, and you can see the channel if you're downtown Mankato, but if you get up to Kasota, then the Minnesota River actually jumped out of that channel and then created its own. Geologists don't know why, and we always think we know everything about geology, but it's not true. They're always finding new things. This whole idea about the bounce here at Mankato is a relatively new theory. Kerry Jennings with the Freshwater Society, who studied geology in the Minnesota River for years, is the one that really kind of formed that idea. And so today what we have is a stream that is much smaller than the valley that it created. It's in a valley that it did not create. If you think about the Colorado River flowing to the Grand Canyon and 2 billion years of cutting down, that's normally how a river forms. Here, the Minnesota River actually formed after Glacial River Warren. Lake Agassiz would have dried out. There wouldn't have been any more water flowing down. Glacial Lake River Warren would have ended, and then you would have had these smaller streams coming into this valley, and that would have been starting the creation of the Minnesota River. So really the Minnesota River is less than 10,000 years. And the thing is, it as a result of being in this large valley, it can move. It can move in many different directions. And that's why we really get this river that curves in many different places. And we're going to hear from some of these early Euro-Americans who traveled through here what they thought about this. But you can see how the river almost doubles back on itself, and it's just a short distance between one part of the river to another part of the river. This is really unusual to see an underfit river or a river valley created like this. Another example would be the Cheyenne River in North Dakota, which had the same kind of formation. Just another view to just give you an idea of what it looked like. We would have had those glaciers coming through. Again, they're pushing up that rock and mud and basically a wall. And then we would have had some of that water forming a small valley. And then once that dam burst at Browns Valley, it created Glacial Lake or Glacial River Warren. And then today what we have again is the Minnesota River, much smaller river than the valley that it's formed in. And as a result, because of that, which is very surprising on a prairie landscape, we have waterfalls all over the place. In fact, Mike and I were talking about some waterfalls to the west of us called Red Rocks and Mound Creek. They don't directly flow into the Minnesota River, but their creek that they are on will eventually flow them in. But we also can think about Minneopa. So we think about on the left-hand side, if we have that double waterfall, and that water is dropping, 40 feet total between the upper and the lower. And then we have also waterfalls like this one. This is Swan Lake Outlet Waterfall. This is over by Jetson. You can actually, if you're paddling the Minnesota River, you can see it. But the best place is there's a Terry and Rick Brown farm that's on the north side of the Minnesota River outside of Jetson. They have a silo. It's easy to recognize their property. They're very accommodating if you actually want to come and see. It's really a beautiful waterfall. And I always think what a great property you must have if you have a waterfall like this that's flowing into your backyard. And so when I talked about that sediment in the water, yes, the Minnesota River always had sediment because it had to cut these rivers, whether they had these major waterfalls or not, they have to cut down to get down 200 feet. And so they're going to carry sediment. So the Dakota were right, by pouring milk into water, it shows that there was sediment, but not dominating the water. We know that we could see from Euro-American explorers, we know that they could see the bottom of the river, which we cannot do today. So we know that sediment has definitely increased here in the Minnesota River. And just to give you another idea, this is a painting done Minneopa Falls in 1862. It was actually a freed slave that traveled up here, Robert Duncanson. And it's surprisingly 1862. You think about what was going on at that time. The reason I bring it up is that where the location of the waterfalls is today was not the location when it was originally created. It would have been closer to the Minnesota River, and it's actually traveled a mile and a quarter, mile and a half upstream. Main reason is the sandstone that it carves through. So again, with geology terms, things are always changing. It's just harder for us to put a modern perspective on it, but just gives you an idea of that rivers, waterfalls, they're always changing, always moving. And so that's the same case with the Minnesota River. As we see it curves, it cuts through different places, creates oxbows and things like that. And then, you know, when we travel through the Minnesota River Valley, especially, we see all these trees. And that wasn't the case. If we look at the landscape historically, there were very few trees. This is actually a painting by Seth Eastman of the Minnesota River in the 1840s. This is near the confluence of the Minnesota and the Mississippi rivers. And as you can see, there are hardly any trees. In fact, Joseph Nicolay, another explorer that I'm going to talk about, talked about how the prairie ran all the way down to the banks of the Minnesota River in many places. What's happened is without fire in a larger extent, and then also large grazing animals like bison, um, woody vegetation can easily take over the prairie. Without that, then you have all these trees. You think about like Septman Mill, and you see all the trees around there. You know, the question is why would you build a windmill among trees? Well, when he built that windmill, there were no trees. We have photos from the turn of the century, 1900s, up by Renville County, and there's not a tree anywhere along that Minnesota River. And so it was primary a prairie landscape, but with other ecosystems, and I'm going to talk about some of that down the road here. Um, for Native people, we have evidence that they really were here shortly after the glaciers had retreated. We have a lot of archaeological evidence around places like Swan Lake, and we can identify 4 distinctive cultures, ranging from what we call the Palo Indians or the big game people. They would have been hunting those large mammals like the woolly mammoths, the giant bison. Beaver at that time was the size of bears. And they would have been these hunter-gatherer groups that moved across the landscape following their food source. And then we get into like the woodland tribe, where they were settling more into villages. They built burial mounds 3,000 years ago. And then about 1,000 years ago, we see the planting of corn and other crops and things like that. The Dakota, they moved here from the east as these American Indian tribes were pushed out of their traditional or their original home areas. They, in turn, actually pushed out the Ojibwe, who moved farther north. And as you can see on this map, and it's not surprising because Europeans, Euro-Americans did the same thing. When you originally settle areas, you look for a water source. And so we see a lot of these villages were along the Minnesota River. In fact, we know that there was a Dakota village along Minneopa Creek near the Minnesota River. And so they made their home here. George Fanshawe, explorer, talked about, this is what his quote about the Dakota and the interaction between them and Euro-Americans. Before the white man invaded them, they possessed all the country. They could conceive of no wealth beyond their use of animal skins and meat. But white men have taught them to abandon the use of furs and to substitute blankets for them. They have now acquired wants formerly unknown, such as whiskey, tobacco, arms, and powder. To acquire these, the Indians must take long journeys, must kill all the animals he meets with, not to sustain upon, but to carry the skins to the traders. And so their life, again, was changing as Euro-Americans, Europeans moved into the area. We've seen explorations starting really in the early 1800s down this area. It would have been more the 1830s and 40s, but even before that, the French were also exploring this area in the 1700s. The gentleman I talked to about, George Fanshawe, He traveled up here on the river in 1835, and one of his comments about paddling the Minnesota River, and he was an Englishman. He sat in the middle, and he had two big French Canadians who did all the paddling for him. But one of the interesting thing is he talked about looking down into the Minnesota River, seeing the bottom, and being able to pick up mussels, which there's no way we could do that today. And so that tells you how clear that water must have been. And this is what it was another journal entry that he has. And I think it speaks to an idea of what this landscape would have looked like. We paddled away at the rate of 4 or 5 miles an hour. When the otters were seen swimming among the tall grass, Milner said the buffaloes were killed here about 5 years ago, but that he thinks the animals have been so prosecuted that they will never return. The muskrats were already work building their conical houses on the marshy grounds with mud and straw, the wild rice, against the approach of winter. As we advance through these low rice grounds, clouds of wild ducks rose on the wing, and we killed them at our leisure from the canoe. If you're thinking wild rice, we think of wild rice, northern Minnesota, but wild rice would have been growing along the Minnesota River. And it really needs good water quality. And of course, today we do not see wild rice here, but it was found on the river. Another gentleman, Joseph Nicolay, traveled up a few years later. And this is what he has said, and just really talking about that prairie. The plateau that opens here presents neither hills nor woods. It is a high, grand, and beautiful prairie. The view to the south seems limitless, the verdena losing itself far away in the azure of the sky. The spectacle is full of grandeur because of its simplicity that contrasts agreeably with the varied and picturesque countryside the valley of the Minnesota presented to us during the last 5 miles. Our route continues in generally a westerly direction, leaving on the right and on the left a great number of swampy ponds, or more often depressions in the soil that form in the springtime. Some mini lakes of grass, as the Indians say. The route is lovely and firm. The prairie plants, tall and plentiful and varied, indicate the soil is good. And of course, just that comment about the soil is good really means that people were already looking at this area for farming. And really the prairie does present some of the more richer soil. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that here in a few slides. George Catlin, a famous painter, traveled the year before Joseph Nicolay. He visited, this is a painting he did of Swan Lake. It's actually in the Smithsonian at Washington, D.C. He actually traveled all the way from the Dakota, which would be over on the South Dakota, North Dakota boundary, all the way to Travis de Sioux here in St. Peter. And this is what he wrote. In this distance, we passed some of the loveliest prairie country in the world, and I made a number of sketches. Swan Lake was a particular and lovely scene extending for many miles and filled with innumerable small islands covered with a profusion of rich forest trees. And another visitor would have been about 30 years later, and this is probably a surprise to some. Henry David Thoreau, of course, we know from his writing, visited Minnesota in May of 1861. And it was on the advice of his doctor for his health. Today, we don't think about Minnesota visiting for our health. We usually head down south, but he was actually terminally ill, and it actually would die within a year. And one of the things that he did here, he was here for just a little over a month. And after 3 weeks in the Twin Cities, that's where he originally landed, he took a steamer up the Minnesota River, all the way to Redwood or the Lower Sioux Agency. And his idea was that he wanted to see the prairie, and then he wanted to also see the Dakota, who he refers to as the Sioux as their other name. This is what he wrote. This is intimately the river of the Minnesota, for she shares the Mississippi and the Wisconsin and all the incalculable value to her. It flows through a very fertile country designated to be famous for its wheat. And that's again would be a surprise to most people, but Minnesota was one of the biggest wheat producers up until really the 1950s, when we started transition into more corn and then later soybeans. And then he says, but it is a remarkable winding stream. So the redwood is only half as far from the mouth by the land as by water. As I mentioned earlier about having this large valley, that river being able to change course, that's what he directly talks to. And so here he goes again. There was not a straight reach, a mile in length as far as we went. Generally, you could not see a quarter of a mile of water, and the boat was steadily turning this way or that. At the greater bends at the Travis de Sioux, some of the passengers were landed and walked across to be taken in on the other side. 2 or 3 times you could have thrown a stone across the neck of the isthmus, while it was from 1 to 3 miles around it. It is a very novel kind of navigation to me. And if you really do get into his writings of here, he was not a happy person, which is understandably at that time because he was sick, terminally ill. So he doesn't have a great view of Minnesota, or what was the Minnesota, what was Minnesota at that time. But it's just interesting of his view of traveling up the river and really showing how that river does curve and wind. So for pre-Euro settlement, the Minnesota River, as you can see outlined there, was really dominated by prairie and then intermixed with wetlands and small lakes and things like that. And then a portion of that would have been part of what we call the big woods or deciduous forest. And I'm going to talk about those 3 ecosystems and really what they were like here in the Minnesota River. And so this is another quote. Early explorers described many of the features we can no longer see, including huge prairie fires roaring across the landscape, abundant prairie chickens and prairie dogs, flocks of whooping cranes feeding in wet meadows, and the beds of wild rice and many lakes and the Minnesota River backwaters. Bison and elk were vanishing by then. Though the explorers encountered many difficult circumstances, they often described the landscape with awe. And I think that really speaks to what the prairie can view, what people view the prairie. And really these wide open areas and the sky that seems to go on forever. And so we were part of the tall grass prairie. We would have been the western edge. And then after you get out of the Red River Valley of North Dakota, and you reach the what we call medium grass prairie. So it all depends on the amount of moisture. And we have a lot of moisture, much more moisture here than as we go to the west. And so really these prairie areas really dominated the landscape. And again, they would have been intermixed with wetlands and small lakes and depressions and things like that. But really, when a drop of water fell, it pretty much stayed where it fell because really the prairie provides a place where that moisture soaks into root systems that can go as deep as 15 feet. And when Euro-Americans or Europeans started plowing up the prairie, the Dakota and other American Indian tribes could not understand why you would do that to this rich grass. And of course, when they saw that, it was because that rich grass provided food for them in ways, but also for the animals that they would have needed to survive on. And tall grasses, this is prairie cordgrass. This actually grows up to 10 feet tall. grows usually in more wetter areas, but you also have things like big blue stem, Indian grass, 7 to 8 feet. When we talk about prairie, people don't realize how you could walk into these prairies and really get lost. And we think about getting lost in mountains or forested, but the prairie was the same way. They could not see over these tall grasses. Much of the travel that would have been done at that time was done by water, rivers, because it was just so much easier. If you think about traveling across these prairie areas and then hitting a wetland here, a shallow depression here, it was not for the faint of heart. And so it created, over thousands of years, it really created some of the richest soil in the world. And that's why agriculture today dominates the Minnesota River Valley, because it is some of the richest soil that you'll find. Hundreds of plants would have been growing on our prairie. We think about the rainforest being diverse, but the prairie was as diverse, if not more. Many of these plants would have been used by American Indians, are still used by people for medicine, and then of course for food. This first one is called cup plant. It's because the leaves form what we consider a cup. If you were a bird traveling across the prairie, what a great place to take a drink of water. Sometimes you find little tree frogs will climb into them. Another one, this is from a wild prairie rose. These are called rose hips, high in vitamin C, in fact, higher in vitamin C than an orange. They would have been used by people for food, mixed with bison fat called pemmican to survive the winter. And then of course, bison. At one time, there were 30, maybe 60 million bison roaming North America. The question we always get, was there that number, or was there a large number of bison here in the Mankato area? And we know from one observation, or one journey, was 1700 when Pierre Lesur traveled up to Minnesota with 19 men. He's actually the one that built what we call Fort LaHelier over at the confluence of Lesur and Blue Earth River. In order to survive that winter, they killed up to 400 bison. And if you think about the primitive guns you would have had in 1700, the amount of time that it would have took to dress, to skin all those animals, they were probably not very experienced as hunters. And the fact that they were able to kill 400 tells you that there were a lot of bison, most likely here in the Mankato area, at that time at least. The other major landscape would have been the big woods. Bois de Grand would have been what the French explorers called it, or Bois Fort. Really just means a wall of trees that ran all the way from Mankato up to Monticello, and then over by Faribault, if you can think about Big Woods State Park, Nerstrand Big Woods State Park. That would have been about 3,000 square miles. And really, it's relatively young area. It would have only formed, I think, 300 to 400 years ago. And what happened is what they call the Little Ice Age, and was what they think was credited to a volcano explosion. This ash in the air preventing a lot of sunlight to form. The earth cooled, and this allowed in areas that would have been dominated by water, like the Minnesota River, the Cannon River, larger bodies of water, to grow trees, because there wouldn't have been as many fires across the prairie. And so this 3,000 square mile area formed, and we have very little. In fact, only about 2% of the big woods still remain. And in prairie terms, we have less than 1%. So many varieties trees. It was dominated by sugar maples and basswood. which of course we do still see if you think about Mankato being that southern edge of it. Again, it was just an area where trees were really thick and not much for fire. There would have been some fire, but definitely nothing that we would have seen like we see on the prairie. Lots of wildflowers, which you can still find in places like Nerstrand Big Woods. Starting on the left, that's wild ginger. The flower grows at the base, so it allows for pollination from beetles, those type of insects. It does have that kind of ginger smell, but it's not the wild ginger that people would cultivate. And then the middle one, that's jewelweed or touch me not, and that is found in again wetter areas. That is named because when it rains, the water droplets on the leaves look like jewels. And it's a great plant if you ever get into poison ivy or stinging nettle, because the sap inside the stems will actually relieve that itching and take away some of that blisters, especially with stinging nettle. And the great thing is it actually grows usually in the same areas as stinging nettle. And then the last one over there, that is white trout lily. That gets its name because its leaf looks like a trout with the brown coloring. And at Nerstrand Big Woods, they're known for the dwarf trout lily, which is very rare and only actually found in 2 counties here in Minnesota. There would have been animals that we went to see on the prairie, like our woodchuck or groundhog. And then we have what we call a gray fox, and gray foxes are known for climbing trees, actually the only canine that can do that. And then of course, wetlands. Like I said, when water dropped, it pretty much stayed where it was. And these wetlands would have been everywhere, whether temporary or seasonal or permanent wetlands. Most of the rivers, creeks, things like that, they were fed by these wetlands and springs. That would have kept the flow going most of the year round. Minneopa really starts or had started in a group of wetlands out in the eastern part of Brown County, western part of Blue Earth County. So our wetlands really play a major role in keeping the landscape healthy. They consider the kidneys of the earth. They filter a lot of pollution and things like that. And again, just attracting different types of wildlife and then also different types of plants growing. Just to give you an idea of how our wetlands have been completely drained, it's hard to farm in areas. This is 7 Mile Creek, of course, just down the road north of us here. And you can just see over time, these were actually aerial photos that they took this from to show what had been the amount of wetlands and then what we find today, which is very few wetlands. And really, it all has to go down to tiling. It's hard to farm crops like corn if you have any sort of water setting in the landscape. They have very short roots and they can't even handle tickling water. So that's really how it's changed. The valley and really the Minnesota River, where we see much more higher fluctuations between flooding events because water does not stay in the landscape. It flows off very quickly. Just want to briefly talk about Swan Lake because I think it's a major feature of the Minnesota River Valley. Up by Nicollet, if you've never been up there, it's almost 11,000 acres. North America's largest prairie pothole. And what I put the map up there for a reason is if you look at Nicollet County, and then you look at the size of Swan Lake, and then you get Middle Lake and some of those smaller lakes, it really takes up a large section or chunk of that county. And so, of course, Swan Lake is known for its waterfall. It's considered a major area for breeding, but also for migration as birds pass heading north, and then now, of course, heading down south. And then, like I talked about with that waterfalls, that's what's coming out of Swan Lake. It's about 8 miles from the Minnesota River. I think about 250 feet above the valley bottom. But really a major area. Chief Sleepy Eye would have had a village there, and I'm going to talk a little bit about him too next, in fact. What's interesting about Chief Sleepy Eye, he was considered a friend of the Euro-Americans. He really tried to follow or to talk about peaceful ways of living with people as they moved into what is now Minnesota. But also, just on a footnote, he actually helped select the site of what today is Mankato in 1852, though he advised not to build in the low-lying land near the Minnesota River because he said it flooded. And so he suggested the bluff of Mankato, which is the present-day Front Street. And he had this village on the southwest edge of Swan Lake until they were forced to move to the reservation along the Minnesota River in 1857. He actually died in 1860. So I'm just going to talk about some of our living resources just to give you an idea what's really happening with the Minnesota River and some ways we can talk about how healthy or unhealthy it is. The first one is the fish. And if you look back in the 1950s, how when they were actually doing surveys of the fish, they were getting more peas and carrots from the canners, and of course, not what you definitely want to see is human feces and untreated sewage, but very few fish. And so what happened is the Minnesota River was a major traveling, steamboats, canoes, but once railroads and roads came through, we turned our back on the rivers, and it became a dumping ground. And so talking about sewage, a lot of our sewage plants just ran straight into the rivers. There was no treatment at all. When they're talking about these peas and carrots, I have a friend who worked for the Jolly Green Giant back in the 1950s and 60s, and any damaged cans they would actually push right into the river. So it's not surprising. It was really a dumping ground. If you look at many cities' original waste place where they had their garbage, it was always thrown down into the river because when the water would come up, some of it would flow away. And so it was an easy way at the time to get rid of your garbage. But as things started to improve, we started seeing more fish. And the one in the corner on the right hand, that's called a blue sucker. And that really needs relatively good water quality. They actually discovered it reproducing for the first time in over 40 years up by Granite Falls, about, I'd say, 5 or 6 years ago. And then the paddlefish, which is another fish that definitely needs good water quality. This is actually taken here in Mankato. She wasn't trying to catch it. It's just what happens sometimes. And of course, you can't keep them, you release them. But think about that fish. It's been around since the time of dinosaurs. Not that particular fish, but that fish species. And so the fact that we're seeing more of these types of fish, and of course we're known for our catfish, tells us that at least on one end we're seeing improvement on water quality with our fish. Mussels, unfortunately, is the opposite, which is not surprising in one way, is because they're more vulnerable. They actually filter water, and so they are taking in a lot. And then also they were devastated when before the plastic and plastic buttons, your buttons were made out of mussel shells. And so that was a huge industry. Here in the Minnesota River, New Ulm was actually a focal point for that. And so they were devastated by that, and then also by water quality. If you get up to Chippewa, Pomme de Terre, which they're on that far west edge of the watershed, they have most of their mussel species intact. Where you get down here to the Blue Earth, and they're only maybe 3 out of 24 original species that are still found. The Minnesota would have had 41, maybe 42 at one time, and we're down to about 24. Compare that to the Mississippi and the St. Croix, they both have most of their mussels, and they're in that 40 range too. So really the mussels have suffered, and hopefully as water quality gets better, their numbers will increase. River otters, good story about that is at one time there were no river otters. Between overhunting and water quality issues, again, they need good water quality for their life. There were no river otters found here. And then as water quality started getting better, they had been on the Mississippi. They were still there. They started coming up into the Minnesota. And then back in the 70s, I think 70s or 80s, they released 22 otters they trapped from the northern part of the state up by Lac qui Parle State Park. And that caused numbers coming down. And so these numbers from these two different populations have covered really the entire Minnesota River now. This is a map from 2001, 2002. So their numbers have increased since then. And so really the otters have made a good comeback. So it's good to see, and of course a great animal. We've actually found places at the confluence of the Minneopa Creek and Minnesota River where they have actually caught fish, come up on land and ate it, and then disappeared. So we haven't seen one, but we know we have seen signs of them. Another success story is the bald eagle. If you know the story of the bald eagles, we were on the verge of losing, which is our national bird. Really tied to DDT, a pesticide that they ingested through various ways. And it wasn't killing the adults. What it did, it provided fragile eggshells, so fragile that when they sat on them, they would crush them. And once we banned DDT, those numbers have started coming back. And so when you think about DDT, that has really disappeared, but then we now have the threat of lead, and that's through ammo and through also lures. And so we've been finding that our eagles are starting to die from lead poisoning. So even though their numbers have come back, they're still worried about some of these effects, especially of lead on them. At one time, I should say, just back up, if you think about the Minnesota River, it actually, at one time, it was 335 miles from Big Stone Lake down to the confluence. It's now 317.9 because the river is actually becoming straighter. It's losing its curves. What's surprising is there's very few dams. This was called the Minnesota Falls Dam. It's no longer there. This was 3 miles below Granite Falls. And it was a waterfalls. It dropped about 10 feet. They took it out a few years ago. And so really the first dam on the Minnesota River is about 230 miles upstream, and that's at Granite Falls, which also was another waterfalls. But really, until then, farther up, then it's the Lac qui Parle Dam. So the Minnesota River is fortunate in that way that it can allow fish and other movement of animals up and down the river because they're not like you think about the Mississippi River. Just a side note on the canoeing with the Cree, 2 young teenagers, Eric Sevroyd and Walter Port. Eric is on the left and Walter is on the right. They actually traveled all the way from St. Paul up the Minnesota River. So think about it, they're paddling upstream till they got to the Red River, and then it was downstream all the way up to the Gulf of Mexico. And so they traveled for 2,250 miles, took them 98 days. But if you ever want to read a book about some of these observations from 1930 when they did it, grab Canoeing with the Cree. It was written by Eric Severoid 5 years later from journals that he and Walter kept, and then they had wrote a series of articles as they were traveling for the Minnesota Star or Minneapolis Star. And it's just really fascinating what they encountered as they were traveling up the river. And of course, in 1930, there was very little water. And so it was really kind of a hard slog for them. Here's the 1951 flood, if anybody remembers. This was really devastating. And really, again, goes back to the Minnesota River and how it has not created the channel that you would see in other places. And so flooding has always been a concern, especially as we build along the floodplain. This is Sibley Park area. North Mankato was the one that was really devastated. They said about 5,000 people were displaced from about 1,500 homes in North Mankato, Lahilier, and Mankato. So you think about 5,000 people in a small community, because Mankato and North Mankato weren't that big in 1951. They said the streets in North Mankato were roaring torrents of icy water measuring 5 to 10 feet in places. And so this was in April of 1951. As people had turned their back on the Minnesota River, by really the 1950s and even before that, probably after World War II, if you guys know Joe Nichols, sorry, he talks about how these servicemen would come back from fighting in World War II, and then they started paddling the river. And so people started taking an interest in it as more of a recreational thing. And this is the case with these two people. This is Clyde and Shirley Ryberg. And they actually traveled down the entire length of the Minnesota River, all the way from Big Stone down to the Twin Cities. And how they traveled was 2 canoes with a piece of plywood holding them together with a motor. And so they didn't actually paddle, they motored. But they wrote that it's a muddy river from the source in the Big Stone Lake to its confluence of the Mississippi at Fort Snelling. Its brown color testifies to the millions of tons of topsoil that leave Minnesota farms for good every season. And so again, that sediment issue was very apparent back then. For those that don't know, we actually were, if you look at it as starting this modern environmental movement of not just destroying everything that we have, it really for Minnesota starts here in Mankato and then farther down in the Minnesota River. So this is the soybean plant that you find over there in West Mankato off of Riverfront Drive. This was actually January 23rd, 1963. A 40-foot high soybean oil storage tank collapsed. It released 3 million gallons of soybean oil. It covered the neighborhoods in that area. In fact, the New York Times ran a photo of a woman and her kids trapped in a house surrounded by the soybean oil. And then when that wave of soybean oil, came out of that tank, it actually toppled storage tanks and rail cars, releasing an additional 500,000 gallons of solid oil and other substance. And so, of course, the Blue Earth River is right there, flowed into the Blue Earth River. What's interesting is as that was happening and then they were pushing all the oil into the river, somebody from St. Paul and the state government came down and said, you can't do that. And what they did then is they piled it into trucks, drove it to the Le Sueur River, and then dumped it into the Le Sueur River. So if you know anything about water, is the Le Sueur River flows into the Blue Earth River into the Minnesota River. So it didn't do any change. It just made the oil in the water much longer. But what was happening downstream is that December of 1962, December 7th, there is a pipeline that crosses the Minnesota River in Savage, and leaks were occurred in there. In fact, the oil company knew but didn't do anything about it. And they figured that over a month's time, 1 million gallons of oil flowed into the river. So then, as this soybean oil and other substances are coming downstream, the ice is melting off, it forms together, it reaches a point, it gets to the confluence, and of course, the number of wildlife that were killed is just incredible. So the dead ducks started to turn up in the river's backwards at the end of the March. When it's all over, they had a final total of 10,000 dead ducks, 177 muskrats, 26 beavers, along with uncounted number of fish, turtles, and songbirds. And so when we think about the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency that was formed in 1967, they go back to this situation, and that's where they say they started to, why they were formed as an agency, is to prevent this from happening ever again. And just to mention, when we were talking about sewage, what is now the DNR, but was the Minnesota Conservation Department at the time in 65 and 66, they started surveying the Minnesota River for recreational opportunities. And what they found is, this is actually a new alm. This is the sewage plant dumping sewage, toilet paper, garbage, everything into the river. And that went directly into the river. And so over time, laws have changed, and of course you can no longer do that. And so really the river has cleaned up so much from that time. In some places it's probably hard to imagine what it really looked like. And then also I can't imagine the smell, especially in the middle of the summer. And then, really Mankato was influenced, and it's still today, by that 1965 flood. Sibley Park had a zoo that had bear and elk and bison and all that up into that 65 flood, and then a lot of the animals were killed or were escaped. And so, what we have today down there was nothing what I hear the zoo was like back then. You think about where West Mankato was, that whole area was flooded. Cub Food, which I think was Red All at the time, that this is that store full of water. And so what came out of that 65 flood, of course, is the flood wall that was built in Mankato. North Mankato was not hit as hard as Mankato was. But it's not only Mankato, St. Peter, New Ulm, a lot of the places up and down the river were really hit hard in that flood. Henderson. Talk a little bit about Tim Crowan. He's the guy in the front with the hat. I guess Raiders of the Lost Ark hat, kind of. And then John Cross is in the back. This is them paddling on the Minnesota River. And so they actually, working for the Mankato Free Press, paddled the entire river twice, in 1998 and 2008. And so a lot of the observations that we get about what's been happening to the river came from those two guys spending really, 13, 14 days each journey on the river. And one of the things that I always take away was the bald eagles. When they paddled in 1998, they said, when we saw a bald eagle, we got really excited. And each time, but in 2008, there were so many bald eagles that after a while, it was like just another bald eagle. And so that just kind of tells you how things, even in a 10-year span, can change. They didn't see any river otters in 1998, but as soon as they put their canoe into the water up on the western edge of the watershed, they actually saw otters in or Big Stones National Wildlife Refuge. So again, just that perspective, even 10 years, things can change quite a bit. Just as we wrap up here, really, if you want to explore the Minnesota River, paddling is the way to go. And, we get this all the time where people think they have to go to the boundary waters or somewhere else to paddle. But I always say that the Minnesota River and its tributaries, especially here in the Mankato area, offer a lot of opportunities and a lot of different types of water. This is the Minnesota River in the Renville County area. But here in Mankato, you can actually paddle 4 rivers without ever getting out. Just because those tributaries, you think about even like the Le Sueur, with the Maple, the Sur, Blue Earth, and then the Minnesota River. So again, you can get in on the Maple, you can travel down, and never have to get out and actually paddle 4 sections of, or 4 sections of 4 different rivers. And so, you know, the Minnesota River, I think it's short shifted, but it's a really beautiful valley, especially, you know, think about this time of year when the leaves are changing, and you think about these rolling hills and this deep valley that was created over 10,000 years ago. I just feel we're very fortunate to have this unique and important resource. And with that, if you have any questions, this is a photo up by Granite Falls on the Minnesota River, just to give you another perspective of what the river looks like, where the valley isn't as deep, of course, because it was farther to the west. Any questions for me?
Anybody? What kind of shape is the Minnesota River in right now for quality? Because I know, what was it, about 10 or 15 years ago, it was deemed what, the worst in the state?
Yeah, it's still got a lot of issues, but we do know that in terms of sediment and phosphorus, we are seeing improvements, though we still contribute a lot of sediment, especially to the Minnesota River or Mississippi River and Lake Pepin. I think it's like 88% of the sediment that flows in the Mississippi River in Minnesota comes from the Minnesota. But we know that those numbers are going down because of conservation practices. But what we're seeing is higher nitrates. And that makes sense because of tiling. That's water soluble, so it goes through those tile lines, where phosphorus, another nitrogen, is sediment, so it has to be attached to sediment. We're seeing some improvements, like I say, seeing better fish. We're seeing those river otters, bald eagle numbers, but we have a ways to go if we want to get back to really a good quality that water. Because I mean, you know, we want to be able to fish, we want to be able to swim, we want good drinking water. So we need to understand that if it costs money if we don't have that, right? So if you have water treatment plants and things like that, they have to be able to handle that kind of problem. So the cleaner the water is, the better off we'll all be. Well, I think that's it. I think I again answered all the questions that there was.
It looks
And
like
I just want to say thanks to everybody, and I appreciate that. And I'm sure I will be back.
Yeah, we are always looking for presentations with Scott. If you don't know, he's got a long list that he offers to us. As a matter of fact, in July and August, we were going to be taking a couple of river trips in canoes, but that, of course, didn't happen. So maybe next year.
There you go. That's right.
We will always look for that. All right.
Well, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
And please know that this will be posted on the Vine website, vinevolunteers.com, and then click on Virtual Vine. We have a list of a lot of our past presentations, including at least one on opossums by Scott that he did earlier this year for us. So thank you all, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.